Anakin strode forward, projecting a confidence and casual air into his steps which could scarcely be more at odds with how he actually felt. To the left, right, above, and even below, again and again he could feel the dragging, clawing sensation of naked attention being paid to him and the men around him, tugging subtly against the skein of his tightly wound telepathic senses. He knew he should have taken comfort from the fact that each and every time, if he focused, he could sense the attention either slide away without suspicion or linger with suspicion of the wrong kind. The Jedi Knight, his faithful droid, and the elite soldiers of Clone Force 99 continued their advance, attempting to act as nonchalant as possible as the group followed after the entranced servitor. Anakin had contrived to use a Jedi mind trick against the man-machine, and had found it so utterly susceptible to his suggestions that, after confirming the length of its new, false loyalty, the Jedi had ordered it to take them to where they needed to go, the ship's central computer systems. And indeed, it had moved without hesitation as if to comply. However, it had also chosen to take the most expedient route to their destination, and, as it turned out, the quickest way to their target was through the bustling, cramped streets of the ship's bowels. Unable to make it understand circumvention, and equally unable to follow its movements through the crowds while hiding, Hunter had hesitantly proposed a risky solution. "Well, sir, we could just follow it. We get rid of any open Republic markings on our armor, take our helmets off, and act natural, and we might not draw any undue attention," the commando had said. Anakin had scoffed at this. "Right, as much as I'd like to take the direct route here, Hunter, I don't think that we'll get away with just openly walking down the street as a Jedi, 4 clones, and an astromech droid. Trust me, the robes and armor, they tend to draw attention," he had said. "With all due respect, sir, that might not be the case here. I've been paying close attention to the locals, and frankly, we may not look as odd in that crowd as you might think. Our armors are not standard, and we've had so many modifications done on our gear that it's far from uniform, or white. On top of that, while we are technically clones, we're also oddballs, mutants, and freaks. Normally works against us back on Kamino, but here, I doubt anyone could guess at a glance that we're even related, much less clones," the clone commando had said, walking over to a nearby wall as he spoke and drawing his high-powered vibro knife. He began to carve into the stone used for the wall here, carefully gouging out one of the gilded, two-headed eagles that they had seen emblazoned on nearly everything. "And as for you, sir, it's more or less the same. If we scuff up your robes a bit and pin some of this Imperial junk onto where people can see it..." He had paused then and grunted as he pulled the eagle free, turned around, and held the rough stone and gold icon out towards Anakin. The Jedi had taken it and grimaced. He rather liked the style and quality of his robes, but the more he had thought about it, the more it had made sense. A hesitant beeping had brought his attention down to R2. "What about him?" Anakin asked, gesturing towards the sentient machine. "The Imperials aren't exactly fans of droids," Anakin had reminded him. "No, they aren't," Tech had said as he stepped in beside Hunter. "But they do not mind certain kinds of drones, and of course the droidmen like this one. So all we need to do is make him look close enough to one of those," he had suggested. "And how do we do that?" Anakin had asked. Tech had shrugged then, and looked around. "It honestly shouldn't be too hard," he had said, eyes fanning the area for a few moments. He had asked permission then for a few minutes to search the immediate area, and had soon returned with a few broken skulls he'd retrieved from the refuse containers nearby. 2 were not real skulls, but rather extremely convincing plaster replications, ornaments of some kind which had been broken and discarded. It had taken Tech only a matter of moments to weld these and a few other choice pieces of discarded junk to R2's cylindrical frame. The Jedi had been hardly convinced by the display, but after a few moments more, conceded to at least testing the idea. Not long after, all of them, droid included, had found themselves cutting almost down the exact center of the broadest of the ship's internal avenues, slowly striding behind the clinking, clanking form of their mindless guide. Anakin had forced himself several times to breathe calm back into his senses as he walked, but found it increasingly difficult. The droidman's ungainly gait was just fast enough to be ahead of a walk, but barely slower than a jog, and all the Jedi Knight wanted at this moment was to be away and out of sight as soon as the Force would permit. Luckily, Hunter had been right, with none of them drawing the kinds of stares or suspicions that screamed, "Oh look! There's the enemy and one of their generals, walking casually through our ship! Quick! Somebody psychopath them to death before they can escape!" The members of the Bad Batch in particular seemed to blend right in, their black, specialized armor evidently different enough from the armaments of the other clones to break any implicit association. They cradled their helmets in the crooks of their arms and hid or obscured their weaponry with tatters of cloth. Imperial double-headed eagles welded to the fronts of their breastplates. The printed skulls naturally ornamenting their battle gear didn't hurt either. Anakin had hidden his lightsaber and raised his hood to shroud himself. Though it had required some more rummaging, R2 had managed to scrounge up a few skull icons, using his specialized tools to integrate them into Anakin's robes, giving the Jedi's clothes some scuffing and burns for good measure. He was hardly pleased by the necessity, but was grateful it seemed to be working. Though some of the shambling inhabitants paused to stare, none seemed too alarmed nor too distressed by their passing, and Anakin could sense no overt suspicion, though he did feel drafts of awe and wonder from a few. Clearly they were mistaking him and his retinue for some other authority, and whatever that authority was, Imperials did not question it. As far as Anakin was concerned, that suited him just fine, as long as it stayed that way. Though, in his experience, anyone or any group high-profile enough to cause crowds to split without staring over long was likely one which could expect to receive the opposite kind of treatment from anyone near their rank. As if to confirm his dread, a small group stepped out into their path, eyes watching him, clearly intent on intercepting him and the clones. Boss, what do we do?" asked Wrecker from the side of his mouth. "Shh! Let me do the talking," said Anakin, walking ahead of the others slightly and waving his hand behind the servitor. "Stop when you reach the woman in the armor," the Jedi whispered to it. The servitor gave no sign that it had heard him, but it did as it was instructed, halting before the three who stood in their path. All three were women, two with their faces hidden behind brass masks, shaped like the picturesque face of a maiden weeping blood, while the one in the center wore a half-dome helmet which covered most of her face, leaving only her mouth exposed, eyes hidden behind a glowing red visor. "Yes, is there a reason you're in our way?" Anakin asked, using his most imperious and authoritative voice. The woman merely stared at him for a time, and then at the others. All three of the women held shotguns, large and square in their armored fists. Though the weapons were not aimed and leveled, he had no doubt they could be in mere moments or less. A cold sweat began to gather under his robes, but he kept himself stock still, watching the women from under the shadow of his cowl. "You are not the Inquisitor," the woman said. Anakin felt a shock of panic run through him, but he smothered it as he smoothly responded without missing a beat. "No, I'm not. I don't recall claiming to be. Were you expecting him?" he asked. She paused a moment and nodded. "He is overdue for the interrogation. Who are you, if not he? Where are you going?" Already, Anakin could sense the clones tensing behind him, hands preparing to heft weapons, aggression rising. He could sense the same coming from the three in front of him as well, yet they did not raise their weapons or outright demand his identity. The clones were holding back to keep their cover. Why were these three holding back? They were still afraid of who he might be, he realized. They had no desire to inflict injury onto themselves by mouthing off to the wrong person, and so they held themselves in check, for now. But as surely as Anakin could sense this, he could also sense that he was one wrong answer away from becoming much more intimately acquainted with the business ends of their shotguns. "I'm his interrogator, of course," said Anakin, giving a slight flourish. The woman seemed surprised at first, but before she could further question it, he added, "The Inquisitor is otherwise indisposed. He said I should be enough to handle it. Do you doubt his judgment?" Anakin asked. He had no idea what an Inquisitor was, or where specifically they fell into the command structure, but from her reaction, he surmised it was a considerably powerful position. "No, not at all. Come then, we have no time to waste. The Silent Enforcer won't be denied her justice for another day. So if you and your master want to squeeze answers out of the seditionist scum, then you are going to have to do it soon," said the woman, stepping back and turning around to lead him away. Anakin scowled. She was not exactly walking in the same direction as the servitor had been leading them. He looked back and saw the clones all staring, waiting to take his lead. "Keep going to the central computers," he whispered to the servitor, waving his hand to send it on its way. "Go on without me, gentlemen. I'll meet with you later. No need to wait up," he said more loudly, turning to follow the three women. The clones stared after him for a moment. "Scrog, what do we do now?" asked Crosshair, spitting to the side as he turned to watch the trundling servitor as it made its way away from them. "We follow orders," said Hunter, waving for them to start moving, following after the droidman. "Do you think the General will be all right?" Tech asked as they moved to obey. "I hope so," said Hunter with a shake of his head. "Well, he needed us pretty bad last time," Wrecker said, speaking just a little too loudly, and earning an elbow to the gut from Crosshair. The big man laughed and rubbed his ribs, but no one else had anything to add to his statement except for R2. The droid released a low, worried whistle, stopping and turning in Anakin's direction, watching the Tatooine slave turn Jedi Knight disappearing into the filthy crowds of the ship. Anakin followed the three women in silence. He stayed behind them and swayed slightly as he walked, keeping himself just out of the corner of their eyes as they made their way to where the interrogation was meant to be held. More than anything, he was afraid that his disguise would not hold up under prolonged scrutiny, and so worked to keep himself from being casually observed. They had been walking for a long while when they reached a set of vaulted doors, which led into an absolutely massive turbolift. A droid man was fused into the wall near the controls, and after hearing an elaborate passcode, the mindless man began to tap and type away, shutting the huge doors and starting the lift as it descended down. Anakin looked to the left and to the right. The space was large enough to carry 10 LAT gunships end to end across, and 7 from front to back, but the 4 of them were the only ones present within. "Is it much farther?" asked Anakin. "No, 5 minutes out after we reach the block. He is already being held in the interrogation room, though we still need the Enforcer to open the door," the head of the three said. "And is she there already?" he probed further. "No, but she will meet us there. She had actually left to find the Inquisitor. She'd still be searching for him if we hadn't found you," she said. The lift came to a shuddering halt, and the doors opened. A profound sense of suffering and suffocating darkness flooded in with them, like a tide of foul air being released all at once. Anakin almost staggered, and even the 3 women before him seemed to stiffen, as if sensing some inkling of what had assailed him. He gathered his wits as quickly as he could manage, and followed the 3 as they led him out. The whole ship had been a dreary combination of Gothic stone and steel. The lighting on the ship flickered, was dim, or was not present at all, and when the light was consistent, it was shaded yellow or red, casting sickly or violent luminescence across the already grim architecture of the vessel. But here, things were different. The lights were white and persistent, and though the walls and floors seemed no less gothic in nature, they still managed to exude an aura of insidious menace that far outstripped that which pervaded the rest of the ship. Perhaps it was the thick layers of purity seals which hung in clusters along the walls, or the faded scratch marks left along the black stone floors. Or maybe it was all the screaming and shouting that Anakin could barely not hear, like a chorus of wailing moans and pleas pulled from his own thoughts and not his true senses. Whatever it was, a considerable wrongness haunted this place, and Anakin found himself working against his own reluctance as the three began to exit the lift, expecting him to follow. Swallowing hard, Anakin took a deep breath and held it, counting out to 4 and releasing it before moving forward. This new place was incredibly stuffy and humid, yet to the Jedi, it felt freezing. The Force was bleached here, altered, maybe even damaged. The threads and fibers which tied and bound it to everything were notably abused, as if stretched and snapped, and then resewn again and again. Just the passing sense of it was making his head throb painfully, and he was forced to constrain a few groans of suppressed agony as the sensations continued to worsen. Nothing I can't handle. I've been to weird places before. This is nothing I can't handle. Anakin found himself thinking. The very act was an alarming sign of its own. So many parts of him were screaming. He had a sense of an impending mortal blow hovering just before him, less than seconds from descending, yet nothing happened, and no one was there. In spite of that, he felt nausea creeping into his stomach and throat, sickening his guts and making his steps feel heavy and plodding. Cold, bitter sweat began to pour from his brow and neck, stinging his eyes and tainting the flavor in his mouth. There were not many visible guards, just those he traveled with and a few patrols he had seen pass them or cross their path at a distance. Noting the walls and how they curved, he began to get a sense that this facility was not very large compared to the vastness of the ship, a dungeon or prison of some kind, from the looks of it. Or perhaps it was something far, far worse. Anakin could hardly hazard a guess, but what he did know was that the Force was worn and tortured in a way he had never sensed before. And he didn't want to even begin to guess what would have had to have happened here to cause this kind of effect. Every time he passed one of the spaced, heavily reinforced doors, he would feel a white-hot throb of pain spike into his skull. With the crossing of each threshold nearly drawing out a hiss of protest from him each time, the Jedi was almost grateful for how short the remainder of their trip was. Soon, they brought him to the door he presumed to be his, a huge bulwark of black steel, covered in purity seals, and bearing a large, engraved number on its surface, number 9. To his profound dismay, this door also produced the same effect, and as they paused to wait, presumably for the arrival of the Enforcer, the Jedi quickly found himself desperate for a distraction. He tried to simply listen, but even the wheezing of the air cycling through the life support system sounded muted, as if the walls were made to absorb sound, which could very well be the case. As they were arriving, he heard the barely audible, distant rumble of the turbolift starting up again. Even from this distance, it was shocking that such a huge, loud thing could be reduced to nary a whisper by walking down a few hallways. "We'll stop and wait. The Enforcer will be along," said the head of the three. I was instructed to convey to you that if you want any hope of learning about the missing agent and his role with your master's competitor, you better do it now. The sister won't allow him to survive another Terran cycle. He's caused enough damage as it is, and if not for the abuses of your agency, he'd be dead already. She added, voice stiff and stern, the voice of a subordinate conveying a contentious message from one superior to another. Yes, fine, I'll do what I can. The false interrogator rasped dismissively under his breath. Anakin had been very curious, eager even, to meet with a potential traitor to the Imperium. There was an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. While he was not so sure how true that statement would be in and of itself, he did figure that it sounded true enough to test out. Now, however, all he wanted to do was to crawl back into the lift they had entered from, and then to be away from this horrendous place. He was about to ask the woman he had been speaking with a question, any question, when she seemed to take notice of him first. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at him. Of course. Oh, why?" Anakin started to lie, but the croak of his own voice was proof enough against his words. His hands and legs were shaking now. He hadn't even noticed. Was he poisoned? Sick? He stuttered as the other two turned to face him more fully. "Dear throne, you aren't a psyker, are you?" the woman suddenly asked, her voice becoming a shrill. Anakin's telepathic abilities were stricken by his state, and therefore sluggish, too sluggish to warn him of the woman's sudden suspicion and following epiphany. However, the Jedi Knight did indeed notice the change in her posture, the shifting of her weight, and the raising of the muzzle of her weapon. The Force-born warrior was certainly distressed, pained in fact. But he was far from helpless, and even as the other two women began to move in sync with their leader, they could not quite overcome the simple fact that Anakin Skywalker himself was standing within Saber's reach of all of them. His blue blade activated, tearing out of the hidden pocket of his robes and flashing through the air and into his hand. The first sweep of the blade killed the woman to his left, slicing her cleanly in half, the follow-through taking the blue saber through the weapons of the other two, one of the shotguns exploding as his burning weapon touched the gunpowder in the shells. The resulting blast staggered all three warriors, though Anakin called on the Force, painful though it was, to push the remaining two Imperials into the wall opposite him, slamming each with enough force to knock them out. He slumped, leaning against the wall beside the door and wiping sweat out of his face. Already, he could hear the heavy, if smothered, footfalls of the nearby patrols rushing to investigate the sounds their struggles had caused. He'd have to fight his way out. His cover was blown, but he wasn't going to leave empty-handed. Looking at the door he had been brought to, he raised his saber and froze. The light that had been with him ever since he was born, the light of the Force itself, flickered and then failed. The Jedi Knight gasped loudly, dropping his saber from his hands, letting it deactivate and fall to the floor, letting it roll away. His fingers scrabbled and clutched at his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. He took a deep breath again and held it, counting down 4, 3, 2, 1. He released it. He could see. He could breathe. But the Force was gone. He had no idea what was happening to him, but it had to be a result of this place, this prison. Reluctantly, he realized that he'd have no chance of escaping if he tried to take someone else along with him, and turned away from the door, looking for where his lightsaber had rolled, and froze for a second time. Standing there, in the hallway, was a thing. Anakin's eyes couldn't place it at first, couldn't quite comprehend it, despite its more or less mundane shape and baseline appearance. It was wearing powered armor, or at least something similar, and was holding a long two-handed sword. It was tall, but not as tall as a space marine. It was a woman, but not like the women he had seen before. It looked human, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. She was unhelmed, bald save for a single topknot of long white hair, braided into a thick rope which reached down to the back of her shins. Her face was smooth, almost as pale as her hair, and adorned with blue eyes that never seemed to blink and pierced the soul. Even through the thick plates of her fitted armor, one could see that she was molded into the lithe form of a dancer, despite how casually she handled the brutal blade in her hands. She was, without a doubt, the single most hideous thing that Anakin Skywalker had ever seen in the entirety of his life. It, or whatever this person, this enforcer was not human, nor anything even remotely close. The death in her eyes was the death of everything, the death of the Force itself, and as she came closer, step by step, the world bleached more and more. Anakin pulled his eyes from her with great effort, starting to search for his lightsaber once again. In near immediate response, the Force-eating creature swept its sword up, striking the bar of fluorescent light above them and shattering it. Light flashed blindingly bright for the briefest of instants, and then the Jedi found his segment of the hall bathed in blackness. Frigid fear worked its way through Anakin as he tried to look around, but found his flesh and blood eyes a poor substitute for his Force intuitions. He tried to reach out to call his saber to himself, but he couldn't even see the weapon nor feel the Force. Realizing his task was fruitless, Anakin crouched in the darkness, fumbling about with his hands, and feeling the cooling body of the warrior he'd bisected earlier. Meanwhile, the thing in the hallway had begun to walk forward, footsteps sounding softly in the shadows. The Jedi could hear, could feel his heart beating in his ears, fingers probing about desperately until he found the stock and handle of the woman's shotgun. He could still hear it getting closer, yet somehow the thing in the hallway was simultaneously becoming harder to hear, something Anakin chalked up to his panic. He gave the gun a few hard tugs, wrenching it out of the warrior's dead grip with a frustrated yell and nearly falling back with the effort. Weapon in hand, Anakin rose, his shoulder against the wall, shotgun out and leveled as he slid up to a standing position. He could not hear her any longer, the only sound the Jedi could make out being those of his own shuddering breaths, and the rapid pounding of his own beating heart. He was sweating still, but now he felt so cold, so severed from the Force, that his bones were aching. Saliva gathered in his mouth rapidly, his body, his very cells, seeming to forget how to function without the constant company of the Force. Despite this, he kept control of his breathing, and kept his mind and thoughts under control enough to know what he was doing. Anakin waited. He listened, and after a few brief moments of silence, he took a step back. He stepped right into the silent monster, and had half suspected that he would. Spraying bitter sweat with the motion, he rolled forward, avoiding the wide flat of the thing's blade. But his hood and robe did not. Caught on the superhuman strength of servo actuators, the Jedi was thrown aside, thick robe torn away by the action, and left tangled on the large sword of this new, monstrous Imperial. To his credit, the Jedi kept his feet, staggering for only a moment before he lifted and fired the shotgun. The blast was inaccurate, and the kickback nearly took the gun right out of Anakin's hands, leaving him briefly fumbling with the weapon. Meanwhile, the blast and following glints of shrapnel striking armor lit the space for just long enough for the enemy's approaching form to be visible. The Jedi Knight kicked, catching the new warrior in the chest, but failing to stop her advance or stagger her back. Instead, she rushed in through the blow, Anakin yowling in pain as he stomped into her unyielding form, and was instead himself carried back and pinned to the wall. He kept his leg braced against her, trying to push back as he brought the gun up again for another shot. He blasted, but not before she had come even closer, forcing his knee to bend and grabbing the muzzle of his gun, yanking it out to the right just before he fired. The shotgun discharged out to the side, showing Anakin another flash of his assailant's face, dead eyes burrowing into his. But soon he did not need the light of his gunfire to see those pale blue spheres of hers. Still pinned to the wall by the pressure on his curled leg, Anakin watched as the sword the woman wielded came to life, sparking along the blade and illuminating its surface with the incandescence of a deadly power field. She held it, single-handed, up nearly against his throat. His free hand had grabbed her wrist, his right hand still clutching the shotgun, she herself having an arm that was similarly occupied. She tore the gun out of his hand, and he raised his palm. "I am one with the Force," Anakin muttered, focusing hard, attempting to pierce the penumbra of fear which had ensnared him, trying with all his might to touch the Force, to use it, to wield it. He watched the woman's deathly eyes widen somewhat, watched her topknot sway in a wind that did not exist, and then watched her respond by using her recently freed hand to grab his neck. He choked, faltering as her ceramite fingers closed around his airway, his own hand instinctively grabbing at her wrist, trying to pry her off. But she was implacable, answering his resistance by slamming his head back against the wall, once, twice, and then a third time. Anakin's vision was spinning. He could feel foam and spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't just that she was strangling him, but now that she was touching him directly, he felt as if his mind were an oyster caught in a crushing pincer, mere moments from splitting open. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He needed help. But this time, as darkness closed in around him, Anakin found no clones charging to the rescue or sudden shouted war cry of help being on the way. All he found, all he saw as his mind faded away into unconsciousness, were those empty, monstrous blue eyes staring, unblinking, unfaltering into his own. Like twin voids expanding in a cruel sky, they devoured him, and Anakin Skywalker knew no more. R2 watched on from the shadows, telescoping eye peeking out from around the corner as they dragged his friend's limp, unconscious body into the room, the door shutting behind the Imperial guards a moment later. Outside the now closing door, the silent woman who had beaten Anakin signed something with her hands to another pair of guards. It had been somewhat difficult to track his Jedi companion down to this place, and he had been forced to rely more than once on the Imperials merely overlooking him, something he hated to do. After all, R2 hated to be overlooked, but even he had to admit that it was oftentimes a pretty useful skill, here more than anywhere else. He had actually ridden down on the same lift as this strange, silent woman, having arrived before her and waited in the corner of the massive cavity. The droid had taken particular care to avoid anyone dressed in red, but even then, it had been far from certain no one else would question his presence, unobtrusive as it was. Yet it truly did seem that, for most he passed, anything as complex as he was beyond their realm of authorized thought, and they mostly attempted to ignore him as he went by. They had even gone so far as to bow and move out of his way once or twice, murmuring prayers to a machine god in their odd, guttural language. This seemed to apply to even the formidable silent woman, as she had not questioned his admittedly distant presence even once. Now he waited, he watched. While R2 had the translation matrix for their spoken language, he had never seen their sign language before, and R2, competent though he was, never claimed to be anything like a protocol droid. As beneficial as he took that to be most days, it did also mean that he had no way of synthesizing a translation for himself. And, as much as he wished he could understand the three, he also knew he needed to act fast. Anakin was in danger, now bound and locked inside of room number 9. The droid tried to use his internal communicator to contact the Bad Batch, Tech in particular. R2 had little doubt that the brainy clone could begin deciphering the hand signs, and, in either event, he was also the only one liable to understand R2's message quickly. Yet, when the droid tried to contact them, he got nothing back but static. His processors initiated cooling cycles as he considered what might have happened to the clone commandos, but dismissed the logic, thinking instead that it was more likely that this place, this small, strange prison, was somehow jamming his communication attempts. That left him with two options. He could leave and try to track down the Bad Batch by one means or another, and bring them to Anakin's rescue, or he could save them all a lot of time and effort and simply do it himself. Locating Anakin's lost lightsaber nearby, R2 resolved to handle the situation personally. Reaching out a clamp and, silently as he could, retrieving the weapon and storing it within his chassis. As if in reaction, the three women turned and began moving in his direction, coming at a jog. R2 straightened himself back around the corner, photoreceptors spinning as he panicked for a brief moment. Where to go? Where to hide? He heard footsteps just beyond the bend and straightened, going rigid and shutting off his light indicators. Milliseconds later, the silent woman turned the bend, rushing past him and towards the lift. The other two came shortly after, though one of them paused, slowing and coming to a stop in front of R2. The woman, who had some blood smudged against her lips, centered her visored eyes on the droid. R2 had to shut down his synthetic response units to prevent himself from trembling, feeling her scrutiny intensify as she stepped closer and then kicked the hatch to his chassis lightly with her foot.
Theodora, what are you doing? We have to go find the Inquisitor, now!
Said the other woman from down the hall.
I know. I just need to throw something away. It's dragging me down. How the bloody hell do you open this trash bin?
Was her response, scowling as she kicked R2 again, nearly knocking loose one of the hastily applied skulls of his disguise. The savvy droid took the opportunity to swing his body up and parallel, popping open his chassis once more. He desperately hoped she did not notice the tools, mechanical arms, and, of course, Anakin's lightsaber, all stuffed within the now visible confines. He needn't have worried. The woman hastily stuffed the broken remnants of her shotgun into the cavity, cramming them in painfully before manually kicking closed his chassis hatch and running off to catch up to the others. R2 waited until he could hear the lift start up again, and then released a low, relieved whistle. Then, with a shake of his rotating dome, he steeled himself and looked down the now empty hallway. After a few minutes, the guards that had been inside exited, walking away in the opposite direction, giving him his chance. Thinking of his imprisoned friend and his beloved owner back on Coruscant, the little droid trundled forward and approached the mechanical controls of the massive black door. He had faith that he'd be able to adapt to one of its ports, but felt more than a little trepidation as he came closer. After all, from what he understood, this room had already housed one inhabitant. And as R2 reached up and began to manipulate the door's controls, he truly could not help but wonder, what kind of creature was considered a criminal by an empire that would make the cruelest hut green with envy? The thought was troubling, but he held on to it. After all, the logic behind that caution was more than sound, and only made him worry all the more for the fate of his Jedi friend. To my most esteemed and illustrious War Master, Lord Tyrannus Macarion II. I am most pleased to report the success of my inquiries, my lord, and am further pleased to confirm your suspicions. While many among the sector regimental forces seem to be more than susceptible to subversion and indoctrination, the Colombian Patriots, widely regarded as one of the premier fighting forces of the sector itself, are anything but desirable in these regards. Your decision, therefore, to group them with the other non-compliant regiments that came from outside the sector was a prudent one. Soon, the losses suffered by those forces shall either ensure their irrelevance or, most ideally, fate them to extinction. Additionally, their martyrdom will further increase the fires that you shall use to soften the loyalty of both the fighting men and officer castes, preparing them for the hammering that is to follow. Still, I do appreciate that only 70% of the Colombian fighting forces within our own command could be transported down to New Cadia, and that the rest will have to be dealt with in their own time, and without undue attention or actions that might draw suspicion. To help appraise you on future actions, my lord, I have taken the liberty of compiling several excerpts from the record known as the Triumph of Pride, which details the induction of Columbia into the Imperium during the Great Crusade. While it is to be expected that a great many things have changed within their culture in the intervening millennia, I have found this record vital in understanding the Colombians, both in how to utilize them and in how to unmake them. It also goes a long way to explaining precisely why the Colombians are unlikely to break away and join our cause fully. Please view it and judge its merits at your leisure. With abundant regards, Pius Gorthank, Adjunct to the War Master. Hello there, fellow fans. This is a fan with too much time, and today I'm going to go ahead and just roll right into the Q&As. So just a quick reminder for anyone who wants to ask a question and have it answered in an aftertalk, or at least a chance to have it answered, go ahead and put Q&A at the top of your question, and then leave it in the most recent video, and that's how I go through them. Alright, so this time I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of starting from the first comments and going up to the last comments, I'm going to start in the reverse, just so that we can maybe swish it around a little bit and give some people a chance to ask questions who weren't there at the very first video. So, let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a look. Q&As. There we go. Alright, Alex Rice. Let's see what your questions are. How many Salamanders and Noble Blood Angel successors are there, and will either and or both be good Imperials? Be the good Imperials. Okay, so I can't disclose with a whole lot of certainty how many Salamanders versus Blood Angels there are. I will say this with a lot of certainty. There are a lot fewer Salamanders. There are no Salamander successor chapters here. They're just like actual... There's like an actual like 5-man... I want to say, what would that be, like a fire team of salamanders that have arrived here to help in the Zectech sector, because they were already in the area, and because salamanders are salamanders, they can't not, you know, defend people from things like Tyranids and whatnot. So they brought their flamers and they were ready for action. There are going to be more Blood Angels than that, I can confirm. And there will be Blood Angel successors, which is part of the reason why there are more quote-unquote Blood Angels. And, you know, the tragedy that the Salamanders can't have successors, I think that might be different now with the Primaris. Somebody please go ahead and confirm or deny that for me, because it's about fucking time we get some Salamander successors. Stop excluding them, they're awesome. Freaking Titanic-ass Space Marines. The Black Dragons are the unofficial successors, in my opinion. But in any case, back to the questions. 2. What would Cheeky or Will learning about chaos and the true nature of the Force/warp from the Imperium do to the Jedi and their teachings? So, funny enough, it won't do very much. And part of the reason is because what they will be shocked with is that things can get that bad. But they would, like, sit down in a council and be like, okay, well, you know, we never really simulated or estimated how bad it would get if, like, the entire galaxy went to the dark side and it just went totally out of control and we failed categorically in our mission, like, not just in defeating the Sith, but in, like, serving the will of the Force in its entirety. That's what this would look like. But it doesn't change very much about what we think or know about the Force and the way it works. They would, you know, essentially say this just reaffirms why we have to be Jedi and why the Jedi need to do what the Jedi do, because otherwise we might end up facing this. And they're not entirely wrong, at least, like, from a certain logical perspective. What is actually going to be more interesting is what happens to the Psychers from the 40K universe as they learn about the actual true nature of the Force and the Warp, because they have lived in the Warp their entire existence, their entire history as a nation, their entire history as a species has been with the Warp, and it's only gotten warpier and warpier as time goes on. But here in the Star Wars galaxy, you have the Sea of Souls, not 100% pure, but certainly a billion, trillion, uncountable amounts more pure than you have around the Milky Way galaxy. So all that to say that when they begin to realize that the warp in and of itself isn't warpy, and that it needs to get warped, and that it isn't warped here, there will be a various amount of very interesting reactions to the discovery or even introduction of that idea into the discussion. Of course, there will be plenty of denial and whatnot, but you'll see. It'll be fun. So let's see here. 3. Is the God Emperor of Mankind the Chosen One? Is he the Chosen One? Is he Anakin Skywalker? No, he is not. Nor is Anakin Skywalker the Emperor, nor will I contrive for Anakin Skywalker to become the Emperor. Perhaps they are both chosen ones of two different galaxies, but certainly they're not the same person. Let's see here. Will other Imperials realize that what C-82 realized? Will other Imperial forces begin to think that the Jedi serve the motive force as opposed to just the warp? Maybe, but most won't be able to care to parse the difference, because a lot of Imperial factions don't actually care a whole lot or even know a whole lot about the motive force and the lore around the motive force. Fulgurite priests and honestly just Electro priests in general are heinously fanatic, and they're not just heinously fanatical about the Trinity in general, though they are that too, but in particular they are incredibly fanatical about the motive force, and they seek to see it in everything they do and everything that they experience, which is why you have C-82 being prone to doing things like that. So there may be other Electro priests that definitely see what he sees, and there may be some that contest what he sees with something else and whatnot. And there may even be other, what do you call them? I'm sorry, tech priests that are not Electro priests specifically that may also see this and maybe even consider it as relevant. But most of the Imperium won't care. They won't even understand the significance of that difference. So that's the answer to that, more or less. I know you said no romance between Ahsoka and C-80. No, no romance. Come on now. How is that? How would that even work? Don't answer that. And C-82. But what about bromance? Bromance. Well, yeah, there could be a sort of bromance between them, or, you know, just a... I mean, there's never going to be a casual or normal friendship between the two of them, because, I mean... Well, first of all, they're at war and on two different sides. That by itself makes any kind of friendship kind of a very weird, specific thing, I think. But they could have a sort of friendliness between the two of them as being people who mutually spared each other's lives and who both mutually understand that the other doesn't want for the war to continue, that they are ultimately seeking peace. So in that way, yes, and that may grow closer, and may be more emphasized or not emphasized depending on how much contact they have during and throughout the war. But yes, you will have the Electro Priest vouch for Ahsoka, and you will have the Ahsoka vouch for C-82 for sure. So I think that's all the questions there for Alex Rice. Let's go ahead and move on to the next ones. John Mandrage. Is that right? Mandrage? Q&A. What would a Imperial Saint look like for a Star Wars Force sensitive? Are there any rogue traders in the Star Wars galaxy now? Okay, so... Okay, so when you say an Imperial Saint, you have to be a little bit more specific because... there are lots of Imperial Saints that do different things, and some of them are even called, like, not just Imperial Saints, but, like, Living Saints. And the Living Saints, some of them aren't even what you would consider to be a traditional Living Saint, in that they don't actually seem to have any powers. They just survived an incredibly dicey situation and have been given a lot of clout and authority and titles by the Administratum, and not the Administratum, my bad, by the Ecclesiarchy. So those things exist, and I mean, to them, they'd just be religious figures that are outfitted with a hell of a lot of crazy-ass weapons and zeal and whatnot. But as for a living saint, insofar as, like, Saint Celestine, well, now it greatly depends on who you ask, because no one's going to see that the same way unless it's explained to them all the same way, and even then there's going to be a hardcore variance. The normal person in the galaxy may very well see it as a legitimate miracle. She is what she says. She is what she says she is, and she's doing what she says she's doing. She is Saint Celestine. She is returned from death by the power of the Emperor because she represents God, a higher power than we know of currently. And they could have, like, there's people in the galaxy that can definitely accept that. The Jedi would think that it's. I mean, the Jedi and the Sith would both think that it's a type of technique, a Force technique. The Jedi would be pretty confounded by it, like, in many, many ways, because as far as they understand it, no, actually, Saint Celestine is selfless. Jeez, she might actually qualify for Force ghosting. Oh my god. The Jedi might see her as a kind of Force ghost, just a very, very... Can I even say, like, more incarnate? Because Force ghosts can do whatever they want, really. They just choose not to. They let the living deal with their own stuff and just kind of guide when they're really needed. They'd see her as a Force ghost that for some reason isn't as ghosty looking. Like, she looks more solid. But certainly her coming back to life over and over again and not being able to stay dead implies that she is a kind of Force ghost. They probably wouldn't think it's the same kind that Qui-Gon Jinn or, like, their Jedi legends speak of, because she just doesn't show the same symptoms in the same ways, but they would certainly think that she's a kind. The Sith would covet whatever it is she has, and they probably wouldn't be very willing to accept that it's because she's selfless or because the Emperor is actually God. They would be like, okay, this bitch is psyker, and she figured out some way of living forever, and I've got to figure that out. And they would just be all over that, trying to figure it out. God help her if they ever got their hands on her, because they'd just be killing her over and over again, trying to figure out how the hell it is she's coming back to life. Of course, God help them, because the biggest mistake you can try to do as a dark side anything is get in the same room as Saint Celestine and not be a billion trillion times prepared to take on a billion trillion times more than you think you're gonna have to. But yeah, that's about that more or less answers that question. So let's see here. What's the next one? Are there any rogue traders in the Star Wars galaxy now? Yes, there are. Absolutely, there are rogue traders. They are definitely there. They're actually already moving around and exploring without the express permission of Orion or anybody else in the fleet. As rogue traders who are now officially outside of a battlefield condition, they can, unless they're immediately countermanded by like someone like the Inquisition, just go and do almost anything that they want, and they are certainly going and doing that. Rogue traders right now are having a nice, awesome-ass field day with just going around and looking at stuff and scouting and even making contact. It's going to be fun to see where they end up, but yeah, there are definitely rogue traders in here. They definitely came with the rest of the fleet, and they're definitely going about. So that was John Mandrage. Let's go ahead and move down to the next Q&A. See here, Q&A. Will the Republic start recruiting citizens? You better believe it. I'm not going to reveal quite what format that will take, but yeah, it's not going to just be the clones fighting against the Imperium, just because there just isn't. I mean, I already said I'm going to bolster the number of clones, and I am going to do that. And it's not that the Imperial Guard are categorically better than the clones, but they are much better equipped and much better supported, and it's hard to deny that. I mean, heck, man, I think that I've even seen whole videos on how shit terrible the tank support tactics for the clones were. The clones are going to get straightened out, and their tactics will adapt because the clones are intelligent, professional soldiers who are very much born of the Mandalorian way of fighting. But unfortunately, because they're starting off with all these janky Kaminoan tactics, and they're not being played with by the droid army anymore, they're going to suffer some hard casualties correcting those mistakes, and there will be a heavy, heavy need to field civilians on the field. And they will be able to, trust me. The Imperium is a scary enough threat that people will be like, yeah, well, I definitely don't want that showing up on my planet, and it's not hard to imagine why. So let's keep going. And that was Joseph Caillou. Maybe that's Caillou. If it is, it's hilarious. Whatever. Maybe it's not hilarious. Maybe it's just a person's name. I have a lot of memes attached to that name. In any case, let's go on to the next one. Q&A. How would Tarkin react to Imperial culture? Would he agree with a lot of what they preach, or would he oppose it? Oh my god. Like, Tarkin, straight up, like, Tarkin would love the Imperium, and he would love everything about it. The only problem is that Tarkin is, and here's the thing, you have to understand this. Tarkin would never betray the Republic, and Tarkin would never betray the Empire. Tarkin, when the Republic became the Empire, to Tarkin, not very much changed. And as far as he was concerned, that was just like a rebranding thing, but he serves the galactic foundation that the Galactic Republic has been holding together for 26,000 years. That is what Tarkin serves, the concept of this galactic local order. And Tarkin isn't really... I mean, he definitely appreciates, in a way that is enormous, the fact that Palpatine lets him have the run of the show and do everything, but that's not the reason he serves Palpatine. Palpatine rewards him and gives him that, but in a large part, Palpatine gives him that much power because he knows that Tarkin doesn't really covet it. Tarkin has many flaws, and he's an evil man in many ways, but one thing that Tarkin is he's loyal to his superiors. That's a very interesting thing that I've noticed about Tarkin through many renditions. And so Tarkin would think that the Imperium is a superior form of government. That it's superior, not maybe in a form of government, but a superior, that it is superior in most ways to the Republic. But his answer to that would not be to defect to the Imperium, it would be to make the Republic more like the Imperium, which you honestly see him do in the actual canon. It's definitely in line with his way of thinking. And that is how he would approach that. Tarkin would never join the Yuuzhan Vong, even if he were offered a place. Tarkin would never join anything that isn't that galactic foundation pillar that he joined up and served from the start. And for him, when the Republic died and became the Empire, it wasn't a death of the Republic. It was just a direct continuation, nothing more than a rebranding. So that's more or less what he would think about that kind of thing. At least from my point of view, of course. Let's see here. And, oh, I'm sorry, who was that? Declan Mugford. Declan Mugford, that was your Q&A. So, next up we have Owen Wagner. Owen. 1. We have seen... Oh, hold on one second. Okay, there we go. We have seen Jedi reading minds and seeing daemons, but we've seen Jedi reading minds and seeing daemons, but will we see any other factions? Necrons, Orcs, Dark Eldar, or even Kroot have many practices that would be horrible for the Jedi. Blade Ones and Destroyers killing everything, Kroot eating the dead, Orcs being Orcs, and especially the Dark Eldar being the Dark Eldar. Honestly, the Jedi would be really cool with the Kroot and really understanding of them. I mean, yeah, the Kroot are cannibals, but they're far from the only cannibals in the Star Wars galaxy, and the Jedi do get along with the other cannibalistic races as long as they don't cross certain lines and it's like kept at a cultural thing. The Kroot typically don't eat people alive, and even when they do, it's like on the battlefield, so I think the Jedi would give them a pass on that. Everything else, however, is definitely a thing that they would have some pretty hardcore reactions to. So you're asking if we'll be seeing the Jedi react to any of the other things? Well, I mean, I can't promise that all these factions will make it in large part because if I fill the Star Wars universe with all the 40k factions, they'll just tear everything apart, and then it'll become 40k in the Star Wars universe, but without Star Wars being super involved. So I don't intend to do that. But when they do occur, you will see the Jedi react to it. And definitely, everything that occurs from the 40k universe and this universe, you will get a Jedi reaction in many ways to it. So let's see here. If not, can we see them react to the behavior of Chaos Marines and cults, such as Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and Night Lords? Like I said, everything that you see pop up, like they will react to it. So that's what you will see reactions to. Let's see here. Let's go to the next Q&A. Richard Witt. Witty one. So let's see. Q&A. Will the Raven Guard, Blood Angels, and Space Wolves make an appearance? Yes. Well, at least they are there. I don't know to what degree I plan to let them make an appearance, but successors or elements of those chapters do exist inside of the Zectec fleet at the moment. So it is totally possible, and should I come up with an inspiring idea that would involve them, it will be done. Alrighty, let's go to the next one. Gundamvid. Gundamvid. Okay, there we go. Gundamvid. I do have a Q&A. Okay, what is your Q&A? Has the prophecy, the one who brings balance to the Force, been altered in any way with the coming of the Imperium? I'm just going to leave that question a little blank, and you guys can use powerful critical thinking and observation skills to determine whether or not that is the case. So, moving on. Let's see. Commentator Q&A. 1. You are planning to have the Imperials being collectively traumatized play a role, but what aspects of the Star Wars galaxy, like the hypocrisy of the Jedi and the Republic, will play a big role regarding the Imperial man's knowledge of the Star Wars galaxy? Will both sides grow and learn from each other? Yes and yes. There will be a Imperial view on the Republic, but you should know that it's very dismissive. The Imperium crushes other governments and then forgets about them and doesn't like to consider them in a very high regard or in a very intense way, other than like how much it takes to destroy them. They don't really care whether or not the Republic is a legitimate government or whether or not they're hypocrites, but I can tell you this, especially as they learn more and more about the Republic, there will be moments of dialogue between forces of the Imperium and forces of the Republic where they're basically yelling at each other in the midst of combat. And you better believe that when those things occur, the Imperials will not shy away from saying, you guys fucking call yourself a Republic, but you're just an empire. You just call your Emperor Supreme Chancellor, and you have fucking slave soldiers. Eat my dick. You're not better. So, yeah, like, you'll get similar interactions to things like that when they do occur. But again, the Imperium won't spend a whole lot of time thinking too much about the Republic unless they begin to see themselves as like having to be defeated by them or pushed back by them or something. It'll have to be pretty drastic for them to think about that because of what the Imperium is like and what they do on a regular basis. Will both sides grow and learn from each other? Define grow and learn and each other. We'll see. We'll see. Watch. It'll be fun. So, have you given thought about inserting some smaller in-between vids, like improvised vids, where we can see one or a couple of people from the factions discuss things about the other faction? Like a Republic researcher making a log about the Imperium of Man's technology history, or some guardsmen talking about the Republic or CIS combatants. Perhaps. Not gonna rule that out. I may do that. 3. How about having a rogue trader make contact with a Star Wars diplomat or something? Stick around and watch. This may very well occur in some way. 4. How will there be some good, friendly things happen? Either on an individual faction or interfactional level. I mean, yes, there will be, like you've seen already. Don't expect it to predominate. Star Wars is pretty well named, and Warhammer, although not as well named, because frankly it's definitely more war-y, is bringing the war here. And there's going to just be a lot of conflict. I mean, even no matter how you slice this and no matter what happens, there's going to be a ton of fighting and a ton of conflict. Even if good guys win in the end, even if the forces of unity win out in the end and there's some sort of conciliation, there's going to be so much fighting even because of that. So just, you know, prepare for that to be the predominance of the universe. Let's see here. Should Necrons come into play, how about having the Warp spit out a single Necron tomb world into the Star Wars galaxy? It's hard to have the Warp spit out anything Necron is the problem. Like, it really is. The Necron tomb... If a Necron tomb world doesn't want to be swallowed by the Warp, it's kind of hard for the Warp to swallow it. It's happened, but it's not easy, especially if the Necron tomb world happens to be awake when it happens. They tend to have technology to stop things like that. But let's keep reading. Like from a minor dynasty or a small outpost, something just powerful enough to warrant an uncomfortable cooperation between the factions out of necessity. You know, I don't want to shortchange any of the factions, is one of the issues. And I feel that if I did something like just pop in a tomb world, just one, it would get defeated. And it would be pretty sizably crushed. I mean, even the Star Wars universe can eventually get around one tomb world. They have Death Stars and stuff like that, and they can make them in a pretty short amount of time when they're pushed. So, I want to give each side a fair shot. The problem is the Necrons are so powerful that a fair shot to them would KO most things. I'm even of the opinion, honestly, that the Necrons in the current canon of Warhammer 40k should just, like when Emotech I think it was Emotech the Stormlord, when he like Spartan kicked the Marshal or High Marshal of the Black Templars, Helbrecht, like clean into a ravine. That's like what the Necrons should be doing at every encounter. They are a Worn Heaven level threat, and it's like, I guess they're just the Swarmer threat, the weak Swarmer threat from the Worn Heaven. But it's even at that point, it's just so powerful that it's hard for me to even buy a lot of the victories that we have against the Necrons as being anything more than the result of just despondency, because they should have the technology, the numbers, and the tactics to crush just about everyone in the universe. I mean, crap, they're all AI. I mean, the ones that can think anyway. So there you go. So that's part of the reason why I'm probably going to keep the Necrons separate or out. And if I do involve them, it'll be in a very unique way, because I don't want to cheat fans of the Necrons of like giving them their fair shot. So that's what I gotta say about that. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Adrian Almgard, Q&A. Are there any Sisters of Silence present with the Imperial forces? If so, would pariah abilities be completely I don't know. I think I answered that one in this video. So let's move on to the next one.
Zinch! Chaos God. Oh, I see. The planner himself is here scheming in my comment section. Well, let's see what your question is, Zinch. Mr. Asker Questions, who answers all questions asked of him with more questions. Let's see. Is the Imperium being portrayed as bad guys here? Will we see their view of the story, or only the Republic from this point on? As I rather enjoyed stories like Lucky 1313. Huh. Let me think here. What episode is this? I do believe that this episode, Blue Blade in the Dark, I think that this one was mostly from the Imperial's perspective. Last episode 2, actually, I think the majority was from the Imperial's perspective, from C-82's perspective. And not only that, but he was definitely not what you would call a villainous Imperial, at least by the standards of the Imperium. And then the episode before that, I do believe, was Rejulia fighting Shakti. And then the episode before that was the squad trying to survive inside of the maintenance compound, which I think, you know, I don't think you can categorize them as bad guys as much as they're just soldiers caught in a war situation. So I think I'm already doing that, honestly. I think that even to this episode I'm doing that. Now, if you're asking me, are they being portrayed as bad guys? Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say this. I don't really believe that when it comes to governments and politics that there really are good guys and bad guys. At least not in most cases. Things have to get pretty bad for there to be good guys, basically. The Republic isn't good guys. The Republic is like a month away from being the Empire, and as Darth Maul said in the in the season finale of well, the series finale of the Clone Wars, the Republic is already dead. It's already changed. It's already an empire. You just don't see it yet, but it's there. It's already done. So, the Republic isn't good guys either, so to say. It just has a lot of good guys on it. So in that way, the Imperium and the Republic are very similar in that way. Both heads of the factions are basically evil, or like the very, you know, governmental forces that are pulling them into power are at least amoral. But both factions have a lot of good people in them and a lot of heroes fighting for mostly just their survival or for what they think is right with all the incomplete information and incomplete power that they have to enforce it with. That being said, the Imperium is much darker, much more genocidal, much more extreme than the Republic is. Even the Empire, once it becomes the Galactic Empire, which don't get me wrong, the Galactic Empire performs genocides and planet destructions and does its own fair share of totally fucked up things, but it covers them up. It just isn't as extreme as the Imperium of Man. So if you're trying to cut this down to things that are more black and white, yes, the Imperium of Man, until it is reformed from being outside of its universe and like trying to be different, until that is the case, then it's almost certainly, if not absolutely, the bad guy faction here. It has no choice but to be. It doesn't know how else to be. It's almost like if you take a shark, a great white shark, you alter it genetically so it can survive in fresh water and you dump it into a lake. Is it the shark's fault that it's eating all the fish? It's all it knows how to do. So it's going to do that until it knows how to do something different, until it even knows that it's possible to do something different. So, yes, the Imperium is in many ways the bad guy here. I mean, not that Palpatine is the good guy. But I don't encourage you to look at the story quite like that. Now, let me see here. So now we go on to Zarya Smith. Q&A. Respondent parts. So is Robute Guilliman going to show up? No, he is not. I have no plans at moment for the Primarchs to make appearances. The Primarchs are too powerful. You know, I will remind you that Yvraine and the entirety of the Ynnari, with a ton of Dark Eldar and Harlequins and Craftworlders and Exodites and, you know, all the Eldar, got together on one planet and were almost wiped out by the shadow of a demonic threat, by the shadow of a major daemon. Then we flip over to the Primarchs on human sides, and you have, like, sanguineous fighting all of Chaos Undivided just by himself, holding it all off, and then breaking Bellacor's freaking body over his freaking knee. And the problem is that even inside of the 40k universe, the only things that could stand up to the Necrons, if anything could, is just raw-ass the Primarchs. So if I drop a Primarch into this universe, they are both individually so powerful, it's difficult to even contrive a way by which a Primarch can die in battle. I mean, read First Heretic, one of the very first Horus Heresy books. And it tells you right there that the smell and taste of Primarch blood is just weird for it to be in the air, because it's not natural for Primarchs to bleed in battle, because they don't take injuries. They're that good and that lethal, and so much more than warriors. So no, I can't have Robute Guilliman show up. He'll fix everything too quickly. He will make the Imperium reasonable. He will reform the Republic and out Sidious in a day. It's not a thing that I can involve without instantly giving him most of the universe because of how level-headed, intelligent, and raw-ass powerful he is. So let's go on to the next one. Also, can you include other Imperial Guard regiments? I think they're underrated. I think they're underrated, like the Penal Legions, Catachan Jungle Fighters, Praetorian Guards, and others. Okay, so yes, I will include other regiments, especially the Catachan Jungle Fighters and maybe a few Penal Legions. I don't know a whole lot about the Praetorian Guard, nor do I know a lot about Penal Legions outside of one or two of my own researched favorites. So I can only promise to go into the things that I know or that I think I know. That being said, I do intend to do that. Let's see here. I think the Republic is demoralized at this point, and are you going to show the Senate perspective and realize that they started it by destroying one of their ships first? Also, can't wait to see the war from a civilian point of view. So there's already been a bit of this Senate perspective, and I've actually had a side story in the community section a little ways back now, where Dr. Sheena is investigating the whole event involving the ship hyperspace ramming the Imperial ship and kicking off this conflict. So that's not being ignored by everyone, but a lot of the Senate is doing what it normally does and shirking its responsibility and shoving it off, and there's no one really forcing them to face it. Certainly Palpatine is not drawing attention to that. So let's see here. Also, can't wait to see the war from the civilian point of view. It's going to be a little hard for me to do that one just without the civilian dying in the story almost immediately, but we'll see. P.S. I don't agree with the Republic winning some of the battles, but I'm still watching to see where this goes. I have a lot more questions, but I can't think of them all right now. Alrighty, well, you go ahead and ask them when you can think of them. You know, I respect your opinion when it comes to whatever it is, but it's hard for me to speak to it without knowing what your specific issues with the Republic are. So, yeah, that's all I can say about that. Alrighty, so then, let's see. Let's keep scrolling and scrolling. And let's do one or two more, and then I'll go ahead and sign off. Alrighty. Russian name, man. I don't know how to read that. The last three letters look like letters. I understand it says Hob or Ahob. More than three letters. It's like four. Oh, there you go. Your question. Maybe you'll recognize it off of the question. Q&A. Is Palpatine going to lift the restrictions on the CIAS? Like, I mean, will he let them build better robots, like stopping them from building B1s and letting them build more B2 super battle droids, or just allowing them to build... Okay, yes, in that he is going to stop actively limiting the CIS, because mostly, honestly, it's not going to be a conscious decision. Mostly Palpatine is going to be too busy with everything else to actively limit the CIS and to feed the Republic intel and get the Jedi out there to destroy factories making the ultra super battle droids like he does every Tuesday to stop the CIS from winning the war. So yeah, he'll stop actively restricting them. Will he push for better stuff to be put forward? Frankly, probably not. Not him himself. He's going to be too busy trying to manage the Republic because he's got a giant mess in his lap and he can only handle so much of it. Dooku, Grievous, you'll see what their reaction to this is and how they decide to manage it. All right, Ricky 4990. Ricky 4990. Let's go ahead and see your question. Will we get to the death camps soon, if at all? Will we get to them? Well, I'm not sure what you mean. We have depicted them already, but nobody is currently fighting to get there. You have to wait and see if we get there in whatever way. But I will say that nothing in the story so far should have indicated to you that anyone is heading in that direction. That's actually one of the big problems that Ahsoka had with this whole plan. She wanted to go and use at least some of their forces to liberate the people that are suffering in the death camps, and Mace Windu categorically refused it, and then cool story citizened her and basically pushed her out of the conversation. So at the current moment, doesn't look like it. Let's see here. Some guy camping. Q&A. Will there be any Imperial defectors to the Republic like guardsmen do with the Tau? You will see. You will see. Alright, let's see. Sevlar. Q&A. I know this is a little late. Are we going to see Quake Cannons on Baneblades, and are there going to be other Space Marine chapters aside from the Sly Watch and the Crimson Razors? Yes, there will be others. Not too many others. I like my homebrews, and it lets me do what I want with them without having to do tons of research every time I move. So I do like them, but you will, as I've mentioned before, see others. And will you see Quake Cannons on Beyblade? So if I'm not mistaken, and I could be mistaken, so do tell me if I am mistaken, but a Quake Cannon is a cannon that a Baneblade shoots into the ground, and it like blasts into the ground and burrows and then explodes and causes an earthquake. Is that what you mean? I mean, first of all, just in general, you will see Imperial weapons, and unless there's a very good reason for them not to be present, then there probably are present. And there's like a lot of Baneblades here, even if in general, in proportion, there aren't many of them. In general, like, there's a lot. If you were to line them all up in a row, you'd think that's a lot of Baneblades, because it's a huge-ass fleet and a huge-ass invasionary force. A bunch of Forge Worlds got evacuated. So there will be Quake Cannons in general, but most likely, if the Quake Cannon is what I just mentioned, then probably yes, there will be. Will I depict them? If I find a place to. I can't depict every single Imperial weapon, or rather I can, but I don't intend to just for its own sake. Only what is, a bigger part of the narrative. But are they present? Yeah, probably. Let's see. John Smith. Q&A. Q&A. Oh, I see. Going for the double down, huh? Will you be using the Anathema Psy-Jammer, the Sisters of Silence, in any of the stories? I'm not sure. Maybe. Let's see. Dave E. Q&A. If Chaos shows up, what kind of chapters will show up? Also, what is your opinion on the Word Bearers and successive chapters? I think Lorgar kind of got fucked over. I think that a lot of people got fucked over. I think that Lorgar did get fucked over, but that Lorgar is also a very huge sucker. He was really... I'll say this. I expect a lot from the Primarchs, so I'm disappointed with quite a few of them, because they're supposed to be very superhuman, and even in their mentality. Lorgar had this obsession with needing to worship something. He was unwilling to let go of the idea that he needed to worship a thing. And while I understand the quest to find God and to see if there really is something beyond, if the thing that you're worshiping isn't your creator, it doesn't actually control the galaxy, and it's actually just born out of everyone's negative thoughts, and you comprehend that and understand it and have incorporated it into the truth, you should know better than to worship it. Like, Lorgar is not someone we would hold at the bottom, end of the bell curve for the population. He's supposed to be at the top. And frankly, he's really not acting like it. He was extremely emotional. I mean, don't get me wrong. Again, this is not to justify the crazy bullshit the Emperor did with him, which is he goes and blows up the Eternal City or the Perfect City or whatever it was that Lorgar built that he was so proud of. That being said, Lorgar should really get the message by that point, and he shouldn't sulk and betray the entire Imperium because of it. The Emperor should have handled it better, no doubt, but Lorgar at no point should start worshipping demons. It just doesn't make any sense. He should not do that. What is my opinion of the Word Bearers? They're interesting, but frankly, I don't like them very much as a faction of Chaos. I'm much more partial to the Thousand Sons because, and this is a perfect dichotomy to explain why. The Thousand Sons don't typically worship the Ruinous Powers. They don't even typically worship Tzeentch in such a way as worship would be concerned. They revere Tzeentch as a source of incredible power and knowledge, but the Tiskins take a much more scientific approach to worshipping and using chaos, and that's why they become sorcerers. And typically speaking, they dominate demons, not the other way around. The Word Bearers are the other way around. They worship demons. I mean, they don't worship all demons, but they do tend to revere them all. And they worship some of them, if not a ton of them, and they want to be used as pawns of chaos. The issue with that is that it either demonstrates that they have very weak wills, in my opinion, or that they don't actually understand what chaos is. Because chaos doesn't have a plan. Even Tzeentch, the planner, the great architect of fate, his plan is just a plan that goes on forever without an actual end point or termination goal. So, if you're a word bearer and you're trying to give yourself over to chaos and then just enforce the will of chaos into the universe, you have to begin with the understanding that the universe is mindless, chaos is mindless. There is no will. That you're not enforcing will. You're enforcing literal chaos, and that there's no point. There's no point to doing that. There's as much merit in enforcing the chaos for the sake of chaos as there is in fighting against it and creating more chaos in the battle, which is exactly the reason why Khorne is so ungodly powerful in the modern age. And that's where I always get stuck with it. And yeah, sure, you can do it for the rewards, like, oh, I will be richly rewarded by the dark powers. And yeah, okay, for a small-minded person, this is enough. But if you really want to reap the rewards of chaos, then you need to go the Tiskin Sorcerer way. Or join up with Nurgle and just be cuddled by all the diseases and be cool with being a super gross, disgusting, rotting person who doesn't really feel bad about it. But out of all the methods of serving chaos or being a member of the chaos faction, the Word Bearers is among, not at the bottom, but among the bottom for me, just because you are offering yourself up knowingly as a tool for chaos against your own self-interest and against the self-interest of any given ideal you might have, because chaos is anathema to most ideals and simply won't settle on one, even if you decide to serve only one of the gods. And from what I understand, and this is the thing, you can't make this, you can debate this with other chapters, but you can't debate it with other legions, but you can't debate it with the Word Bearers Legion, because the Word Bearers are very stubborn in their attempt to adhere to the Chaos Powers Undivided. And the fact of the matter is that Chaos Powers individually can be contradictory. The Chaos Powers among each other are as anathema to each other as the Emperor is to all of them, if not more. And that's a fucking problem. That's a huge issue. That's like one of the biggest issues with the whole idea of that. You can't serve Chaos Undivided. You can only be torn apart by it. And I think that the only person who has figured out how to quote-unquote serve Chaos Undivided properly is probably... Please don't flame me for saying this, but it's probably Perturabo. Because if Perturabo hates Chaos, and he despises the Chaos Gods, and he despises being used as a tool, and he's just made of loathing. But Perturabo is, to my understanding, a Daemon Prince of Chaos Undivided, and we're not even sure quite how that came to be. Like, we know that he sacrificed an enormous amount of gene seed from the Imperial Fists to accomplish this, but the conditions, the rules, the circumstances under which he became a Daemon Prince are still very, like, ill understood. And what he's been doing since then is also still very ill understood. So he seems to be the only one with even a chance of having done that and made it make sense. Other than that, I think the word bearers are pawns, but not in a flattering sense. And they know it and they choose it, and I don't understand why. And that may be because it is chaos. It's literal insanity. And there you go. And that's why I'm an Imperial faction player, because I don't get that. But there you go. So for me, Tiska all the way. I love them sorcerers. And that's, wow, I went off on a tangent on that one. Okay, I'll answer one more of these Q&As, and then that'll be it for me, guys. So, let's see here. Pablo Alejandro Guterre, you know who you are, Lou. All right, Q&A. How would you keep the Imperium of Man relevant in the long run when the Republic will adapt their tech eventually and will still have the advantage of playing in home? You will see. Stick around, and that will be a part of the fun. Because trust me, the turnaround won't happen as fast as you might think, but when it does happen, there will be many ways by which the Imperium reacts. And yeah, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put it down there. Until next time, I'll see you later.